thanks so much for talking to us. I know you're very busy, and I know, but we've met a couple of years ago, and the question is that we were, and your academy, the things you were talking about, the whole ideas of enlightenment are a lot about the how to fight populism, how to make this fair game in politics, how make people more involved. But what we see today, we have Brexit, we have Donald Trump winning the US elections with very populistic slogans, and we're speaking about the situation in France, elsewhere. So do you feel that, it went wrong, something went wrong, and what are your thoughts on that? What are your concerns?
Well, thank you. It's great to be on the program. I think it's a complex picture. I think, first of all, things aren't going wrong in one way, which is to say that the world is still a much better place now than it was 20 years ago or 50 years ago or 100 years ago. That people are, generally speaking, better off, that actually, for example, globally, we've done very well on alleviating poverty in recent years, and that despite the terrible tragedy in some parts of the world, and particularly one thinks of Syria, the world is, relatively speaking, a more peaceful place than it's been in the past. So I don't think we should give up on the idea of human progress. Human progress is continuing, and with technology, there's the chance for much more. But certainly there are a particular set of challenges that we've got right now. And I think that, in a way, for me, the starting point is almost an emotional one, which is in the face of outcomes that one might not want, Brexit or the Trump victory, which I guess most people of the kind of centre-left don't want. My own organization is politically independent, but that's my personal background. We can either kind of get self-righteous and despairing and, as it were, turn in on ourselves and say, oh my goodness, the world is full of terrible, awful people willing to vote for terrible, awful things. Or else we can be self-critical and determined. And we can say to ourselves, what is it in our own behaviors, in what we have done, which has led to this situation, and how is it that we need to change? And I think that when you look at both Brexit and you look at the result in America, yes, as you put it, populist tactics of Brexit, the populist tactics of Donald Trump succeeded, but that isn't the only story. The other side of that story is that the establishment, the kind of centrist, broadly progressive view of staying in Europe and of voting for Hillary Clinton failed. And we have to understand that failure and to think very hard about it. And one of the things that slightly dismays me at the moment is that the kind of the centre, if you like, of politics, the political establishment, is, rather than entering into that deep process of self-criticism and self-examination from which it needs to develop a program of action, instead there's a kind of self-righteousness. As I say, there's a kind of contempt almost for those people who have voted for something different that we don't like. So the starting point is to explore what we've got wrong.
For the end, we had a very, you might not remember, but I remember while we having the interview three years ago, we also ended up that, there is the reason to be optimistic overall. There is, doesn't matter that in media it probably sounds different, but there was a concern that 100 years ago, 1910s, people also felt that there is a progress, but then something went totally wrong, if you speak about development of the 20th century. So what are your real concerns? Where also, how do you think about that? Especially at this moment when, things look good, but...
Yeah, so I think the big problem we face right now is anger. And I think that we live in a world where we are too many people are succumbing to or being encouraged to succumb to a view that the reason their life isn't how they want it to be is it's somebody else's fault. And that's dangerous because that plays into a human emotion. There was some research published, I think, just a few weeks ago that showed that, as I'm sure you know, most human beings tend to exaggerate their own qualities. So 90% of people, for example, think they're above average drivers. Now, the fact that 90% of people think they're above average drivers, so what? That's just a quirk of human nature. But it turns out that of all those misattributions, those things where we think we're better than everybody else, the one that is most pronounced is moral righteousness. That is to say, everybody thinks that they are in the kind of most morally righteous group in the population. So, most of us would say, I am in the group of the most morally righteous people. Now, that is a kind of necessary characteristic of the human race. We have to kind of believe that about ourselves, or else we'd be plunged into depression. But it's become, in the world in which we now live, the world of social media, 24-hour news, technological change, political populism, that tendency to think we're better than everybody else, or that our tribe is better than everybody else, is now becoming a really big problem. And the role of democracy and of politics and of institution builders is to find ways of tackling that human characteristic, to find spaces to bring people together, to remind them of their common humanity, to get them to overcome that desire to believe that everything that's wrong with their lives is to do with other people who are somehow oppressing them. Now, I'm not suggesting there isn't oppression in the world. I'm not suggesting there aren't bad people in the world, and I'm not suggesting that we don't need to argue for change. But we do need somehow to address this slide towards ever greater anger, because when you're angry, and this is a personal thing, which I'm sure you recognize, when you're angry, you're less rational and you're more likely to do stupid things. And as you say, human history over the last few hundred years is mainly a story of progress, but it is also in the 20th century a story of tragedy and disaster and genocide. And so a world that is more angry, a world that is more irrational, a world that is more prone to doing stupid things is a world that we should be worried about. And that's why it is urgent for us to think about what are the new institutions that we can develop which help people to get out of that headspace and instead to focus on our common humanity.